I'd like to introduce our author, Mark Z. Danielewski. He was born in New York, but has lived in many places. He's won many awards for his work. He is the author of The Familiar, Volume 5 of which is coming out later this month. Only Revolutions, The 50-Year Sword, and The House of Leaves, the novel that introduced him to the Philippine audience, which came out in 1991. That's when we first saw his very unusual way of writing, which we will discuss in greater detail. So he's working on presumably volumes 6 to 27 of The Familiar. And he's also toured with the Beishmon in support of one of his books. And he communicates with cats, which we totally understand. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mark Z. Danielewski. Mark, welcome to Manila.
Thank you very much.
You've been in this part of the world, but this is your first trip to this city.
This is my first time in the Philippines, yes.
Okay, so we'll cut to the chase. So you write books which are massive in scale, ambition, and physical effort. And for many years, we've been told that print is dead. So by doing this, in an age when people say we're supposed to move away from paper, is this an act of faith in printing, or is this an act of suicide?
And what if I say it's an act of suicide?
Well, this is very long suicide because we still have 22 volumes to go.
Well, first of all, we are living in an era where people tell us a lot of things, like print is dead, or other sort of political things that turn out not to be true at all. So we have to remember that when people tell us something, it's not necessarily true. But the more serious answer is really that I don't attach myself to the end result. I spend so many years working on a project that if it ultimately found its endpoint in a different form, I would be open to that. If all of this work and research resulted in sculpture or a piece of fragmented glass on the carpet, maybe that's what I would do. So it's people. The curious thing is how much people enjoy the books in their paper form, but they can live in a digital form if they choose. But somehow the collective readership, I think, understands that the one thing that's missing currently in the digital world is this element of the three-dimensional.
Yeah, the tactile.
Exactly, the tactile, how you can move through the books in different ways. In The Familiar, the characters are all dog-eared, so you can see by color exactly where they are. So if you want to just cut to Zafra and her kitten, you can just go to those pink, moments. Whereas digital has just a different way of a more generic way if you want to navigate.
So as you said, you start out writing a novel, and then it could turn out to be sculpture or an installation or
exactly
completely different.
It could be. So I'm not really attached to the page, even though my books currently are living in this format, and they are showing the kind of vitality. There's no question where I think my publisher was giving me the statistics that most books that come out sell about 30% in e-versions out of their total sales. And mine, for whatever reason, sell only 3%.
In e-version.
In e-version. They want to.
So that's the secret to selling object books. Yes,
I guess, yeah.
Okay, so are we to assume that you do not work with an outline? Since you literally do not know what the outcome will be. You're not that attached to.
No, I have many outlines. In fact, for The Familiar, which is this 27-volume novel, we have all sorts of walls dedicated to outlines, to graphic progressions. Chalkboards with magnets holding up all sorts of different pages, dry erase boards.
Do you work in a warehouse, a very large?
I like a larger warehouse, actually. No, it's a modest studio, actually 2 studios, but it's constantly thrumming with activity. But like a great journey, you may go with a map. You may look at your Google Maps or whatever app. And then ultimately you're going to face the world or the neighborhood that you're in, and you're going to discover something new, something that's not on the map. So there's this constant dance between what the outline is saying and what the characters themselves are saying. And ultimately, the characters will always trump whatever idea I have for their future or their destiny.
Okay. And so, you not only write the words, but you also design the layouts of the pages, and so the look, the visuals are integral to the work. And so, on a side note, how do you get away with using so much paper? Doesn't your publisher beg you, please, could we not have this black page here?
All the time. There's a constant back and forth begging. I think the difficulty for a young writer now is that they don't necessarily have a body of work that suggests that these kind of layouts can work. The idea is that the more successful this project is, exploring sort of the visual elements of how text can reinvigorate a story, the more open that door will be for future writers. Because the truth is, I could not have embarked on Film Familiar had I not had success with House of Leaves and Only Revolutions and so on. And it was as I began to explore this linguistic materiality of the book form that that my publisher realized there was an audience for it. And of course, I don't really accept that there were blank pages. What I view those pages as, it's a pause. It's a moment for the reader to face their own sort of imaginative impulses before moving. It's a way of kind of opening the reader's eyes to their words and their thoughts.
Yeah, so your books are really a challenge to the linear way of reading, because something like Only Revolutions, for instance, after every few pages you have to flip the book to continue reading it.
Right. It is linear, but it's also circular. It is infinite, but it's also finite. And again, it emphasizes that three-dimensionality, because the Only Revolutions is basically a road picture. It's about two 16-year-olds who are flying through 200 years of United States history. But at the same time, it only feels like 4 months. But you start on both sides of the book, and both their egos are enormous, so they're taking up most of the page. And then slowly, they begin to get closer and closer together until they finally find this harmony right in the middle. But then, like many a tragedy, Romeo and Juliet, they begin to separate, and their egos begin to trade places. But it is quite literally an ego trip. And I should warn all prospective readers of that book. It is the most advanced book. It is a very difficult book to read. It is possible, but you are challenging yourself if you decide to start there.
Yes, and you do have a lot of faith in the reader, because you write difficult books.
I do.
Stuff that we will assume are not pitched to the mass market audience.
Though this is a very nice selection. I've always said, I always put my faith in the reader. Never underestimate the reader, and I have not been disappointed. I mean, there are readers who want to excel at reading because they understand it's a way to increase their own imaginative capabilities. And if you have that increased imaginative capability, you can embrace more fully the world that you're in, the situations that you're in. And that's really the quest of literature. It's not a pause, it's not a brief moment of distraction. It's actually a way to embrace something without the risks of a real life situation and better yourself.
I'm going to remember that the next time people ask me why I spend so much time reading.
And I have to say, by the way, reading is very important, and I just have to take a pause here, a footnote, if you will, and say that Jessica was very kind yesterday to give me her book. And and I have to say, that first story, Lamentations 5:23, what a wonderful experience, because I've been in Manila trying to understand Manila. And like my own books, I can't understand it. It's incredibly complicated. I don't understand the transitions from neighborhoods, all the stories. I've been reading the Philippine Star every morning. Oh my gosh, the gamut that runs between just sort of the fun and trivial to the most sort of heartbreaking stories. And here Jessica, in 1,000 words, managed to sum up the kind of energy that moves between all of these stories, the sense of humor, the risk, and it was actually through this literary moment that I began to perceive more fully Manila. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Was there a point in your life when you realized that you were going to be a writer? What other careers did you explore? I know that you've acted, you've designed, you've done a lot of stuff.
Well, I managed to sort of stumble in front of the camera. That's what I call an acting experience. I was actually very lucky in the sense that I always knew I wanted to be a writer from an early age. And I think that came out of just a profound love of words, of language, of culture, of art. And I think it also came out of the sort of familial factors that my parents were constantly moving around, and they were sort of, my father was a filmmaker, so he was constantly dependent on other people to make his projects live, and many of those projects didn't live. But as a writer, I realized the only one I could blame was myself. You know, all I needed was a pen and a piece of paper, and I could make that happen. So throughout my life, I've always made choices to serve that vocation. But I was lucky in that sense. At the age of 10, I told my parents I was going to write a novel. There was a manual typewriter, and I said I was going to write a page a day, and I did. And they were expecting a fantasy book or a sci-fi book. And it turned out to be a 300-page novel about a young man who becomes a cocaine addict, beats up a police officer, and goes to jail. And it was called The Helicopter. And that's what their, at that point, 11-year-old son presented. They were very worried.
But it's great that you have parents who supported you through this. Because a lot of parents, you know, if their children say, I want to be a writer, in the Philippines in particular, they would say, why not, you know, law school and then write on the side?
You know, in fairness, my parents were very similar to that. They were worried, and I think it's my father, who was, you know, a professional artist, a filmmaker, recognized how difficult it is to follow that kind of path. But there really was no stopping me. It was a passion, just constant. Even when I tried to get away from it, I just came back to it, you know, and then it remains as strong today.
And how does a story occur to you? Because you've written across genres. For instance, The 50-Year Sword is a campfire tale, and the classic campfire tale, and then, you know, it's a horror story, and then you've got Only Revolutions, which is a road trip, which is also an ego trip, as you mentioned. So how do these stories come to you?
Very slowly. You know, it really is like watching a tree grow. And I think maybe that's how I approach story. It's very patient. I know that it will begin to reveal itself, and that's the great. It's not something that's instantaneous, but it's like something you tend to get on. And I think my commitment to these long-term explorations sort of reveals the story slowly. I mean, I knew that House of Leaves was so interior. It was all about getting to the heart of things, moving into that darkness. You know, it was a centripetal book, and I knew that Only Revolutions was going to be a centrifugal. I wanted to get out of the house. There literally are no houses or walls in that book. And then I realized it was about that feeling that we've all had when we're 16 years old and we fall head over heels for someone or the idea of someone, and then that idea of just racing out of that context. And then, as I began to proceed, I began to understand sort of this three-dimensional thought, that the book would literally become the wheel of the car that they were driving, and so on. So when I got to The Familiar, I knew that it was going to be this long arcing story. Like, I wanted to write something that made me no longer, that didn't grant me the security of just writing something on my own and finishing it, but actually embarking on an adventure that required my faith in the reader and the reader's faith in me. You know, this idea of, will we get to the end? You know, and if we do, we will do it together. There's no way I can do it on my own. And consequently, this project has begun to include many more people. Researchers, translators, artists, maybe a potential artist in the audience today will help in future volumes. And So there's a story already in place, as we talked about with outlines, but at the same time, the story is also continuing to reveal itself.
So the reader's reactions factor into how the story continues.
Yes.
How much of the reader's reactions goes into the...
Well, it's similar to how much is a tree changed by sunlight and water. You know, it's not a dramatic, exactly. It's not a dramatic sculpting of a radical change, but it does slowly nurture a direction. You know, as readers become more involved with characters, as readers share with me the pieces of music that they love, the books that they love, then slowly that begins to sort of enhance certain elements of the book. And my role is not only to write in this kind of closed system, but also to be open as well to those influences.
Yes, and in one of your interviews you mentioned that you saw The Familiar as being sort of like, you know, big sprawling TV shows like The Wire, kind of going in many directions at the same time.
Yes, very true. So House of Leaves is very much about a movie, Only Revolution is about music. Like you pointed out, The 50-Year Sword is the oral tale, the campfire tale. And then the sort of the loose scaffolding for The Familiar is the television show. It's, you know, 5 volumes make up a season, and we'll have 5 seasons, basically, with a little extra when we get to the end.
27 seasons.
Seems impossible, doesn't it? Right? You're
The
like,
Simpsons has
you're looking
lasted
at that,
30 years.
I'm not even going to get close to that, right? But you know, I should point out, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that as much as this is about a television series, you might say, or it's about a little girl who finds a tiny kitten and rescues that tiny kitten that turns out to be much, much more than a tiny kitten. You know, what it's also about is an engagement with a kind of conversation that goes beyond a few hours, a few moments on Twitter, a few days on a blog, but actually extends into decades. Now that's a curious thing to engage, right? But literature is the place that we have to engage exactly this kind of conversation. Because how are we really going to have a conversation about climate change? How are we going to have a conversation about these enormous things that expand over decades if we can't begin to engage it in our own culture? So as an artist, I'm responsible for bringing that kind of understanding, how those conversations develop. It's not something that will instantly be apparent. We're fooling ourselves if we think we can make decisions about something as broad as climate change, or even our lives. Think about it. If we're lucky, we could get to be a century old. How are we going to engage 100 years? If we're lucky enough to have wonderful families, how are we going to engage decades? So the project of The Familiar is really to engage that kind of conversation. And for the intermediate to advanced readers, and you pointed out that these are difficult books, one volume takes about 12 hours to read, okay? And one volume comes out every 6 months. So all I'm asking is 2 hours, not every day, not every week, but just 2 hours a month. That's all.
Just one traffic jam.
Right. One traffic jam, exactly. That's right, one traffic jam a month to experience something you can't experience anywhere else, and that will begin to reflect the kind of complexity that these long-term conversations have, whether it's climate change, your family, or your own life.
And we talked about how the world today is so bonkers and unpredictable that it's getting hard for fiction to compete with the reality. For instance, we knew that an orange was going to be president of the United States. So these are challenging times. An orange. So these are challenging times for fiction writers. So how can we compete with reality when reality is so insane?
It's a great question, and I think the element to remove is competition. Fiction isn't competing with reality. Fiction is opening up a way of understanding reality. And I meant it when I brought up your short story. I, in that short period of time, began to understand the pulse of it. I began to understand the emotional place of it. And that's what literature grants us. It grants us that emotive connection to the story that's unfolding. It's not so much to replicate it, to necessarily make sense of it, but to represent it so that we can internalize it, begin to experience it, and then draw our own conclusions and make wise choices.
You know, which reminds me, because I do a travel show, whenever we do it, whenever we're going to a different destination, I try to read a book that's set in that place, so sort of get the emotional temperature before we go there. So anyway, if you had a typical working day, what would it be like if such day existed?
This is the exciting part. I get up at 5:20 in the morning. I do some sort of physical activity. Usually it's yoga or some sort of hiking or the gym. And I have a very healthy breakfast. And then I write anywhere from 6 to 9 hours, 6 days a week. And that just goes on and on. And the schedule for The Familiar is so demanding that it's all the time. It's volume 5 is coming out at the end of October. I was working on volume 6 this morning in the hotel. So just there is really no break. But at the same time, I feel incredibly fortunate that I'm able to do that.
So, do you work in a specific place, or can you work anywhere, like in a noisy restaurant?
No, I have a studio. There's 2 studios.
And
One is
you compose the words along with typography?
yeah, design works hand in hand. In fact, a small example is what's been happening here, is that I'm working on a tiny new section. And as I was sort of exploring the voice of these few pages, I began to sort of explore some of the font choices, which then sort of modulated the voice. Then the design elements began to change the story and so on. So they're constantly going hand in hand. In The Familiar, the sort of graphic strategy for each character is pretty much in place, but there's sort of new explorations that develop.
What program do you use now? Because I read that you used Work and Design.
Now it's in design. It's Creative Cloud, and it's a very powerful system that allows us to deal with graphics and textual layout and communicate efficiently with my publisher.
Okay, and then tell us about your editing process. How do you know when a story is finished or when it needs to go in a different direction? Just come back.
I think it's the way a pregnant woman knows that it's time to give birth. It's accompanied with pain and just sort of a sense of doneness. You know, I take such a long time. I mean, remember, I started The Familiar in 2006. It came out in 2014. 2015, excuse me. So it just was, actually, it's 9 years. So it's not 9 months, it's 9 years. So that by the 9th year, I began to sort of sense that it was fully formed and wanted to move out into the world.
Do you work on different books at the same time, or you have to do just one?
There's some sort of, well, for instance, volume 6 is the start of season 2. So there was a good month that just went into sort of recalibrating the arc of season 2 and just working on sort of some of the trajectories. Even though I'm willing to recognize that those trajectories will change, and then now it's just volume 6. Now we have a big board with all the chapters, names on them, and then we have a color coding scheme, and red means panic, and blue means done. And right now that wall is nothing but a bunch of red dots.
So how do you feel when you see the panic wall? Is this like, yay?
I feel panic.
Okay.
It's not like, oh cool, it's like absolute
So it's
terror.
not like a motivation thing, it's just plain terror, yes.
It's like, are we making any progress there? No.
So I'll be asking, we'll be taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and after a couple more questions, I will turn it over to the audience. Okay. So do you read reviews of your own work and reply to them?
I never reply to them, but my philosophy is if I'm going to read the good ones, I have to read the bad ones. But my skin has gotten thicker over the years. Actually, I think that more important is just the discussion. I think I even noticed it in myself. I'll be talking about a book and I'll be skewering something that I thought didn't work. But then I'll start to recognize in myself that, boy, I've been talking about this book for a while. So there's something there. And I realize that with other people, they want to write an extended, scathing review, something was touched. And again, that's what's important.
Because when I looked at your Wikipedia page, it mentions that you were initially disappointed at how the critics tried to put House of Leaves into convenient, available categories, calling it golden literature and so on.
Well, I wouldn't trust everything you read on Wikipedia. I mean, my reaction to how House of Leaves was received was complicated. I mean, it was the book that was rejected by 32 out of 33 publishers. It was the book that my publisher said would maybe reach 1,000 people. And then at the same,
and amazingly, it's still in print.
It's still in print. The sales actually are increasing. So it's had this very wonderful kind of fortunate life. And as I like to say, my books are really like my kids. They begin to grow up, and House of Leaves has grown up. So now they have these very intimate relationships with readers. And like a good dad, I'm happy to meet my kids' friends, but I get it that you kind of want dad to get out of the way. So it's okay.
Okay, and you're a great friend of cats.
I am.
When were you first adopted by a cat?
Good question. I was young. The cat's name was Philip. It must have been 6 or 7. But Philip turned out to be a Philadelphia. And there have always been sort of animals. One of the things it's not 100% true because I've said this before and I was contradicted. But in general, cat people love all animals. They love dogs too, so I kind of fit in that group. I love horses, goats, whatever. I mean, I need the spiders in my backyard, so it's kind of strange. But then I do know dog people who just really want to hunt squirrels and cats. It's a very different attitude.
Questions? Who wants to start? Anyway, you have Rexes.
Devon Rexes, 2 Devon Rexes, Archimedes and Mafunda. And
where did you find them?
in Seattle, in a barn. I was on tour.
Okay.
How's that for a sign? And I just fell in love with them. And the person who had them said, well, you can't have them because they're too young. So I kept in touch. And I actually flew up to Seattle to get them. And then Mafumado, named after Buddhist hell, nearly died, swallowed some sort of toxic cat toy or something. And I was bereft, but we pulled through, and they are a life source for me.
So, yes.
Hi. So,
What's your name?
My name's Kazumi. I was wondering, of all the books that you have, which one would you suggest new readers start with first? Because they're all very complicated, and you did mention that only Revolutions is a little bit advanced. So, do you have one book that you think everyone should start with just to be familiar?
Without a question, you should start with the familiar volume book. It's very relevant. It's very exciting what's going on. There's a Facebook book club happening right now. You can go check it out. You don't even have to join. And it's kind of a wonderful community of readers. And I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of. Don't get lost in all the details of what's being uncovered, but you can see that it's a conversation that everyone's having from different parts of the world that they're sort of thrilled to be working on together. So I think it's a great way. In some ways, it's easier than House of Leaves. There is complexity there, but you don't need to embrace it if you're not ready for that. And it's a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm surprised that there have been no film or TV adaptations of your stories yet.
I won't sell the rights.
But would you do them yourself?
Maybe. I occasionally have those conversations, and I feel if the right person came along, I might do it. But for years, I just said no. And what I used to say, and I still say it, is if you want to see the movie, you read the book. There's no shortcut to this experience. Because I think the most important thing that books should offer isn't necessarily the story or how it unfolds, but it's an experience that you can't get anywhere else. If I'm not giving that to you, then it's not worth your time or your money. So what I spend decades on is creating something that's going to unfold in the reader's mind and heart in a way that nothing else can. And that is one of the special provinces of literature.
Yeah, so writers are really lucky because we get to invent stuff as we go along.
We get to make up things for a living.
Right. Questions?
Yeah, is it okay if I tell a story and then thank you for something before I ask my question?
I have no problem.
Because, I mean, my first...
Your name?
My name is Kenneth, sorry. My first contact with your work was House of Leaves. And my immediate reaction after finishing reading it was recommending it to as many of my friends as possible and buying extra copies so that I could share it with them and talk to them about it. So I have this one... Sorry?
Thank you.
I have this one friend of mine, he's like very, tall, muscular Japanese guy, bald head, really badass looking, more competent than me in nearly everything, and I lent him House of Leaves. And I should thank you very specifically because I now have something to hold over him, because when I called him the next month and I asked him, have you finished reading this? Can we talk about it? He was like, dude, I couldn't finish it, I was afraid. So, first of all, thank you for giving me something to hold over that man, because I will never have anything else to hold over him. My next question is, my actual question is, one of the things that I noticed in House of Leaves that I really liked and kind of opened the experience up for me is that, not to spoil anything, but they're like generally 4 layers. And the back of the book says that, there's a concept album that comes with it, right? And I don't hear a lot of people talking about that concept album by, I think that was your sister, so. And so I tracked it down, I listened to it, and I realized it felt like it was a 5th layer on top of everything. And reading the book and then listening to the concept album, like I'm a gamer, so I'm like, I tell people, if you listen to the music, that's the true ending. You get the true ending out of the story, which you normally might not understand just reading through it. So I haven't started with the familiar yet, but I was wondering if there were any plans to do that type of like kind of crazy cross-media promotion.
So what Kenneth is talking about is that my sister is extraordinary, the real genius in the family, extraordinary musician. And in 2001, she put out an album called Haunted. The only correction I'm going to offer is that it really wasn't, it's a concept album, but it wasn't a layer, it was more like a root. Because my sister was writing this album as I was writing House of Leaves. And I would listen to tracks that she was working on, and they would influence the book. And then she would read parts of the book, and it would influence the record. So like one of the Escher drawings, with the 2 hands drawing themselves, it was very much back and forth like that. So Haunted is more than, it's not a soundtrack or an accompanying tracks. It's almost the DNA of House of Leaves. And I love that you point out that the music does carry that emotional content of the book. And it's for those who can't see it, it brings out its more romantic motifs, the story of the heart, really. And I have to say, I'm a little worried about your friend. I know you're holding House of Leaves over, but the worst place to be in House of Leaves is in the middle. Like you're stuck in its absolute moment of terror, its moment of darkness. So maybe as a good friend, you sort of need to lead him through to the end and bring him, compassionately lead him into what the end offers.
One of these days.
Well, it is true that when we encounter a book that we really love, we buy many copies and make our friends read them so that we have someone to discuss them with. So that's the mark of a fan.
Though I like to say reader. I don't like the word fan. I feel fan is for sort of like teenage idols, like idolizing someone, the way they look or whatever, what they wear. I just love readers, because the readers are engaging, the work.
Questions? Miss Professor Hidalgo.
Hi, I'm Christine. I have 2 questions. One is, you said you started writing when you were how old?
I was probably 7, 8.
I was wondering what kind of stories you were writing, not when you were 7 or 8, but as you were growing up and when you were a teenager. That's the first question. And the other one is, were you ever tempted to write a regular realist short story? And if not, why not?
Well, the odd part of this is I sort of touched on a little earlier that the book that I wrote when I was 10 was about this kid who became a cocaine addict. So weirdly, I was probably more attached to what we would describe as the realist narrative. But the more and more I wrote, the more and more I began to see that this realist narrative was really a set of biases that were created by culture, that were created by publishers, as the only way to voice a set of events or a set of ideas. If I had to categorize myself, I would say I'm not like a classical physicist who deals in the motions of large bodies, like planets, the motion of light on a large scale, these kind of like the large rules. I'm more of like a quantum physicist. So I actually feel that my stories are more realistic. I feel that these perturbations in text, these colored words, the way things are arranged, actually elicits a more accurate response in how we encounter narratives. That in fact, the way things are sort of patly placed in a linear form is not really truly the way we think and create narratives. And out of that kind of fantasy result all sorts of kind of prejudices, because we expect the world to look this way. We expect love to act this way. We expect political systems to behave this way. But in fact, it's far more complicated how we arrange the world, how we perceive the world. So in the familiar, you have at least 9 different viewpoints, and you move between these characters who voice all sorts of languages that are strange to the reader. So that's a simple example. There's a Singaporean character who speaks English, bits of Hokkien, Mandarin, Cantonese, even German. And there's a frustration that elicits in a lot of readers, because they all say, well, I can't understand that, so you're failing. Well, not necessarily. I'm creating a space for that kind of strangeness that's everywhere in the world. I mean, trust me, when I was walking outside here, I was, hearing all sorts of things I didn't know. But how easy it is to filter those out and not give them place. Instead of recognizing there's something strange, I can be curious about it. And allowing that kind of alchemy to take place. So, in answer to your questions, simply put, I do write realist books.
One more, please. Is there anything, do you see any similarity between why you write the kind of stories you write and why the Latin American marvelous realists write the way they do? Is it the same kind of motivation? The feeling that realist, so-called realist literature does not capture reality?
Yes, considering that Borges was an influence on House of Blues.
Without a doubt, yeah, there is a Latin American pulse there, isn't there? I do. I think probably one of the problems with magical realism is just that it has magical, right? It's one of those misleading terms. But I think absolutely, and I think one of my most basic positions is that I started probably around when I was in college to eschew the monolithic voice. As much as I love the monolithic voice, I recognized that it was doing a disservice to readers. And what I mean by that is that we can become enchanted the way someone speaks, whether it's the minimal phrasing of a Hemingway, or whether it's just, the wild interrogations of Roberto Bolaño. These are magnificent voices, but in some ways what they do is they frame the world in that voice. They create a narrative of that voice. We can even look at it in terms of sacred text, the way the Bible, the King James Bible frames a certain narrative. But my experience, again, is that the world doesn't operate that way. Everyone has a different voice, and these voices are creating multiple narratives, and so we have to let them in. Even if it's Singlish, or it's Spanish, or it's coding, there are different ways that thoughts arrange themselves. And the real voice that we want to hear, that we want to perceive, is how all of those in concert move. Now, the one thing we haven't touched on, which is central to the familiar, is that we're still in the human project. We're still giving voices to society. So this little kitten that Xanther finds, as feeble, as on the edge of extinction, is also connected to the vast, powerful forces of nature, that which will never have a human voice. So how do we find that place, right? How do we give voice to that which will never have voice? That kind of astonishing power and astonishing weakness. That kind of weakness that if it is to go extinct, will extinguish us. Where do we place the conversations that storm fronts have with mountains? You know, the way waves speak with shells. You know, how do we recognize how forests feel and sing? If we can't begin to interrogate that and offer it a place and welcome it into sort of the pantheon of our imagination, do you think nature will be kind enough to have an imagination where we exist?
Thank you very much.
Good answer. Questions? So, your writing, the way you describe it is sort of your way also of processing and replicating the real life chaos that everybody has to deal with.
Yeah. Finding its heart, finding how we are situated. Chaos is a tricky word. Now this is that moment. This is that moment where someone has a question and they think it's a silly question. And then they realize, oh, he's gone. Who knows when he's going to come back to Manila? Why didn't I ask him? In fact, he was sitting on the stage saying, ask the silly question. We'll have fun. We'll get to say hello to one another.
Please, go on.
I am Thaddeus. I have a question about your next volume, which is named Redwood. There was a mention of Redwood long before the familiar on House of Leaves, page 547. The line looks like this. Redwood, I saw him once, a long time ago, when I was young. I ran away and luckily, or no luck at all, he did not follow me. But now I can run anyway. This time I am certain he would follow me. Have you always thought that Redwood, which is named after your latest volume, would be a major plot point in the familiar long before your written House of Leaves? Has the idea of creating a TV series to novels always been floating around your head years before writing House of Leaves? Or at least ideas just came to you after writing House of Leaves and decided to find it somehow?
So first of all, two questions. Is that a cat T-shirt you have? I really quite like it. So well done. And did you say your name was Tadeusz?
Yes.
That was my father's name. So that's a sort of haunting. Do we have time for a little story? Okay. So I always knew that Redwood was a central part of the familiar. Way before even the familiar started, really, I knew that Redwood was just going to be this pivotal thing. And I'm extremely excited that it's finally coming out. Can you imagine having to write 4 volumes before you get to the one called Redwood? And as this very astute reader pointed out, Redwood has been sort of mentioned in previous books. It was mentioned in House of Leaves, and it's also sort of some other stories. It's so central that it was one of those things that I almost wanted to have happen in volume 1, because maybe I wouldn't get to volume 2, you never know. So the fact that volume 5 is now finished in the warehouse and is ready to go out is extremely exciting to me, and I'm very, very proud of it. Now, when I was working on The Familiar, I could have accepted an advance, based on the fact that Only Revolutions had been nominated for a national book award. But I decided to hold my feet to the economic coals and write The Familiar without any money coming from my publisher, so that they would not be able to say, oh, this is what you kind of weaseled your way to doing because we kind of made a book deal with you. They would actually have to read it and decide for themselves if it was worth buying. And that's what ultimately happened. But before that deal happened, that deal was also about to fall apart. It wasn't happening. And I realized that whatever it was, 7 years of work, having finished 5 volumes, working on the next 5, that it may have been all for naught, and my career was over. So a friend of mine was actually, in this month, a friend of mine said, do you want to come to Burning Man? Now, for those of you who don't know about Burning Man, it's this strange event in the United States that takes place in the desert, where a bunch of people ravine. And there is no animals, there are no plants, there's just this alkaline lake bed, and they play dubstep 24/7, and they stay up constantly, and they wear all sorts of luminous things and put art projects out on what they call play. Now, I hate crowds, I hate dusty situations, and I can't stand dubstep 24/7. So I thought, this is the perfect place for me. I'm gonna get out of my comfort zone. So I went, but my patience was tried, and about 3 days into this thing, I decided I would pedal, because you only can ride bikes, to the very edge of this kind of city. And there I was completely alone, and the sun was setting, and I was very happy. I was even sitting in a half lotus position. And I was stunned by just the natural beauty, you know, and I realized that all of it was vanity. You know, I saw these twisters moving across the lake, and they were shot through with sunlight, and I was like, there was Pharaoh's column of fire, you know. These are the mountains. Whatever I am doing is irrelevant. And I found this kind of moment of peace. Whereupon that peace was interrupted. Because as I looked out, I saw this tiny little dot approaching me, getting bigger and bigger. And eventually it was some kid on a bike. And he came up right next to me. There is no one anywhere. There's miles of sand. And he sits right down next to me. And he says, you know, am I disturbing your moment? And I was like, well, now it's our moment. So he sat down next to me and he began to tell me how he had taken some acid. And he had had a very bad trip, and he didn't like Burning Man at all, and he wanted to go home, and he didn't know if he should be a doctor or a psychologist, and he was having problems with his mom, and he loved his sister, and then I began to realize, like, I'm that old man on the mountain in lotus position, and he's looking at me for the answer, and I don't know what to do. So he offered me a piece of grapefruit, and I remember it was kind of an eerie moment, because suddenly a big fly landed on this piece of grapefruit. And I was like, I hadn't seen a bug there at all. Like, it was this kind of charged moment, this beautiful grapefruit and this big black fly. And the light was getting darker, and he asked a little about what I did, and he'd never heard of me, and I was like, fine. And then it started to get darker. And because the lake bed, the playa, is white, you can imagine that kind of vibrancy that happens right at dusk when the sun is gone. It's this sort of dark, shimmering blue. And I realized I was alone with this kid, and I didn't know who he was, you know? And as close as we were together, there was actually no contact, right? And I realized the time had come for the old man to get up and go back into the city. So I stood, and I said, well, you know, good luck. And I said, by the way, my name's Mark. And he said, nice to meet you. My name's Redwood. I've never met anyone named Redwood. I would challenge you to think if you've ever met someone named Redwood. And then he was gone. And for me, it was that moment where the desert, in that very haunting way, suddenly told me there was more at work here than just what I was planning. And I went back home, and the deal fell into place. And in fact, the contracts were signed right around the date that Volume 5 focuses on. So the contract was signed on September 18th, and Volume 5, Redwood, takes place on September 18th. It's a little spoiler, sorry. But anyway, it was that moment of recognizing that the world is far bigger than you.
And it also gave you a story.
It did. Yeah. And I'm happy to share it with you today.
Questions before we go to the book signing, where you can ask him questions personally. Please.
Hello, I'm Aldrin. As a writer for you, words are obviously of great importance, and throughout your work, one recurring theme is the power of words. In the 50 Years Sword, for example, a common interpretation is that words, especially words designed to hurt, can don't have effects until much later on, until 50 or so. And in the Will Stowe letters from House of Leaves, Pelafina often reiterates the power of words in her letters to her son. And in the foreword to the companion book to House of Leaves, Pelafina asks Walden, what words do you live by? I'd like to ask you the same question.
I literally live by these words.
I love when, readers quote you to you. It's the best.
I really don't know how to add to that. I mean, they are, people ask if I have tattoos, and I say my books are my tattoos. They say, what words do you live by? Well, they are literally right here. And I would be doing you a disservice if I offered you some pat response. But I'm gonna try, because I want to reflect maybe where I am now. Because remember, I started writing House of Leaves over 27 years ago, and it came out 17 years ago. So where is that voice of Pelafina? And I guess the words I live by are the words that come before words that are no longer words and can never be words.
Questions, please. It's kind of like,
just do it.
okay, I suddenly remembered an old Seinfeld episode where George's father has anger issues, so the therapist says, whenever you're under stress, just say serenity now. So he goes around yelling, serenity now! Questions? One more before we move to the side.
I'm Sana. Don't worry, it's a very two simple questions.
No. Throw us the this was easier.
Yeah, but I just want to mention my book club discussed your House of Leaves, and it was really it was divided. Some of the members are here who read them, and from my perspective, I said it was one of my best books for that year when I read it, and because you were just comparing the e-books with the physical books, and the physical book, when you read House of Leaves, actually you can feel the terror, then the plus, I don't want to give any spoilers, but I felt the dizziness. So really, the way you conceptualize the book was really very good. It was something that we had to discuss, so that was discussed in my book. My first question is, with the House of Leaves, can you say the characters were based on someone that you know or yourself? Because they were very rich characters, very layered. And for you to write those characters, was it someone that you were inspired by, or were you just walking, then you heard somebody, you were inspired by them? And the second question is, have you, well, I'm not sure if you have done it, but have you considered having the House of Leaves familiar series in what you call this audio pod, because of all the noises,
So starting with the last question, yes, I have. I'd love to see the familiar as an audiobook. It'd be fun to realize House of Leaves as an audiobook. I think it will eventually happen. It's an undertaking, so it requires money, it requires time, and the way I become involved in these things, that needs more time. I'm not willing to just sort of farm it out and say, oh yeah, just find some guy who speaks English and you can handle it. I'd have to have a lot of oversight, and the amount of work that the familiar takes makes that a little daunting. But we are trying to do it, and eventually it will happen. In fact, I am in conversation with someone right now about at least starting volume 1 of the familiar. As for characters, that becomes more complicated, right? I mean, part of the great human, quality to literature is that we all recognize in all the characters bits of ourselves. So that's one of the things that the reader and the writer share. You can recognize oh, I get that impulse. That's not me. I would never do that. We would be horrified by it, but we sort of still understand it. Now, the project of the familiar is to go even further and say, well, how do we recognize the wind in ourselves? How do we recognize the sea? How do we recognize the feel of it? Moving more in that direction. But of course, there were real people that absolutely inspired. I mean, I didn't publish anything until I published House of Leaves, and I was 34 years old.
One theory online is that Johnny Truant is based on you.
Sure, but everyone says that, right? You know?
Well, everyone assumes that all the characters in your books are you.
Are you, right. But what I want to add is that during that period I had all sorts of jobs, and one of them was I was a plumber's apprentice. So I worked for sort of a punk rock plumbing group in Los Angeles, and we would do bars and clubs and homes and all sorts of things. And I certainly met a few Johnny Truants, you know, who were sort of, you know, working with me. And I think part of the things that I still love to this day about Johnny Truant, and I love them in all the characters in The Familiar, is that just because they aren't book smart doesn't mean that they're not incredibly intelligent. I mean, Johnny Truant is based on these characters who did not go to college, you know, who did not even finish high school, and yet they were incredibly intelligent. You know, they were incredibly adept at the way they processed the world. And that's the same with The Familiar. There are many characters that, even though they come from different worlds, different sort of, you know, wealth hierarchies, they are capable of great intelligent insights. I'm going to Singapore after this, and part of that is because I have to continue the research for this character who lives in Singapore. So, of course, it's more than just wandering down the street and catching something, but nevertheless, the street sometimes offers you a little something.
Okay, shall we have the last question?
Okay, so
Hello. There's a lot of pressure. This is the last question.
yes,
All that talk about a nice, easy time. Now it passed. Now it's all wrap it up.
okay, so
You are.
I'm Nico, and I have to say that I've heard about House of Leaves in the early 2000s, and this is the only time I'm beginning to read it. And I'm introducing myself to your work, and I'm happy that you actually are here. I have to admit my unease about reading in such a style, because at least from the limited context that I have, I do appreciate a more realist perspective, because it creates, I think, to a certain sense, as an understanding, whereas introducing these kinds of styles would be a little more difficult to, as you've said, some of these books are difficult to get into, but you have a faith in the reader. What I do like about what you've said is that there seems to be a thing about boxing oneself in a more realist style. And I do like the spiritual connection that you seem to have made with that guy named Redwood, and that seems to drive this kind of writing style. But I guess my unease, this is more of a reaction, I guess. My unease, I guess, comes from your different context. In the Philippines has a different context, and one of the questions I wanted to ask: what did you feel about concepts like nationalism? Is that passé to you? But I think in the Philippines, it's not passé at all. So I guess, how do you find yourself in your own context? I'm not sure if this is the right question, but there are people from other parts of the world who still write in a realist style, and you come up with your own style of writing. And how do you see yourself in that context, in your own writing and publishing context? And maybe that could also help me understand what I'm feeling.
Well, this is a very beautiful question, because it's a very difficult and perhaps impossible question to answer. Because I think what's central to what you're saying is your unease. What is it about that unease? You know? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, to move out of your context, which you said. I mean, that is, again, another project of all books of literature, is how do we move outside of our context, the cage of our culture, you know, the bubble that we live in, you know, and the fact that you're having this reaction and that you're willing to share it with us is actually very moving, because there is something terrifying about powerful works, you know, and it means if you're feeling that unease, then you're ready to read those kind of works, because they always stir that. They stir within us the sense of the unfamiliar. They stir within us the sense that what if our context is working against us as opposed to helping us? They stir within us the longing to be with the comfortable familiar, but then the fear that also could just extinguish the meaning that our life could have if we were willing to step beyond it. So by recognizing that unease, I would say you are on the path of a great reader. And I don't limit it to House of Leaves. There are many great books out there in which to explore that, but your reaction is exactly right. There should be a little bit of terror. These are not animals that are in cages or in aquariums. They are out in the open. That is what great books are, and they will change you, and you have to be willing to engage them. So good luck.
And with that, let's move on to the signing, unless anyone has any other passionate reactions and confessions to make. So, signing.